Hello, everybody. My name is Florence Soares-Dabalos, and I'm a licensed marriage family therapist who enjoys working with grief counseling. And so today we're going to talk about bereavement counseling and walking with clients through that journey. I do have a couple of co-hosts here, Dr. Ju and Dr. Marshall. I'm going to ask them to monitor the chat. If you have questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat. I cannot promise that I will get to the questions, but maybe we can do an FAQ kind of sheet and email it to you later. So if you are here also to get CEs, you can receive a CE for today, a CE unit, and you should have gotten in your confirmation email for today a link to fill out a survey so you can get that CEU. If you have any questions, Dr. Marshall can answer those questions for you. I am recording today, so hopefully you've been able to give your permission. I will ask that you turn off your video cameras and mute yourself to save internet functionality, as we are expecting almost 250 people today. And so I'm hoping that the internet will hold up. If for some reason we lose connection, don't worry, I am recording this. We'll get you a link to make sure that you get a video copy of it. So with that said, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen where it says bereavement counseling, walking with clients on their grief journey. And I'm going to assume that that you are here because you do have an interest in bereavement counseling, maybe some clients yourself, or maybe you just want to learn more about how to help yourself and your family members, as we've dealt with a lot through COVID. So I'm going to give you a little taste of bereavement counseling in 50 minutes. It's a little harder to do a real in-depth discussion around bereavement counseling, but I'm hoping I'll give you enough to at least get you started in this area. So, there we go. So the first thing I want to start with is, let's begin with grace. Roshi Joan Halifax came up with this mnemonic. She's done a lot of work with the dying, end of life care, and she runs a program called Being with Dying. And this acronym is really about creating compassion and resiliency for yourself and the people that you're serving. And so we have to center ourselves first. So I want to invite you to begin with grace today in this workshop or in this presentation. So let's gather our attention and just be really mindful of our participation. And participation in this presentation will be basically to pay attention. If you get triggered, as it's possible you might, please take care of yourself. If you need to hop off the presentation to take care of yourself and hop back in, that's perfectly okay. But I invite you to be fully present today. I want you to recall your attention, remind yourself of your motivation, of why you're here. When you're working with somebody, you would do the same. Remind yourself of the motivation of why you're doing this type of work. Attuning yourself is really paying attention to what's in your body, on your mind, and being fully present. And then to consider, how best can you serve others when doing this work? So when you're going through today, I want you to think about how you might use this information to serve others. And then the E stands for engage, enact ethically, and end with interaction. And we engage and enact through mutual respect by creating safety and trust. When we're working with clients, we ask open-ended questions. And then always ending your sessions and inviting your client to do the same thing. You can ask your clients to begin with grace as you start a session, but you want to end with some sort of release or ritual, whether it's a deep breath in and out, or whether it's to invite clients to do something to end the session, whatever that needs to look like. So I'd like to start by just asking you to center yourself as best you can, maybe put your feet on the floor, flat as can be, and really feel yourself grounded. And taking a deep breath in for about a count of 4. And releasing for a count of 5. Okay, that just slows us down a bit so we can focus on what we need to for today and when you're working with clients. I want to give you some grief statistics. So in May of 2019, WebMD surveyed a little over 1,000 Americans, and 50% of those respondents stated that they had had a loss within the last 3 years. The Recovery Village website states that older adults experience grief at higher rates than younger adults or children. And about 2.5 million people die in the US annually. And that leaves behind an average of 5 grieving people. Now, this was before COVID. So we can imagine that maybe 2.5 million and then plus with COVID. Again, that's still leaving behind an average of 5 grieving people. And then according to the childhood bereavement estimation model, 1 in 14 children will lose a parent or sibling before the age of 18. That's about 5.2 million in the US. So there's certainly a need for grief counseling, bereavement counseling. And so I'm really glad that you're here so we can continue the work together. So when you're meeting with somebody, the first thing that you want to do, especially for the clinicians in the room, is you have to be able to assess one's grief. So it's important to know that not all bereaved individuals require counseling. Normal grief, which we'll talk about the types in a minute, they may be able to move through their grief journey just pretty regularly. Yes, the pain is there, but they're able to get the supports and move through the grief journey as best as they can. You'll need to assess grief symptoms or triggers, and then look for anniversary dates. You can do what's called a loss history or a timeline of loss. That's basically writing out on a piece of paper just a line and then years or decades, and have somebody list the types of losses that they've had, what kind of loss. And then if you are a clinician, a mental health professional, you can actually use the complicated grief assessment to rule out persistent complex bereavement disorder. So that's a simple Google search. You can be able to find that. So we must assess first, right? You'll see pictures throughout my presentation, and it'll make sense as we go along as to why they're in there. This is a picture of my father. He died in October of 2016. I had what was called a normal grief experience with his death. And normal means that it just kind of goes along, the feelings, the symptoms come up, and I'm able to, or anybody in a normal grief experience is able to move through it within a period of time of usually about a year. The intensity of grief tends to lessen. I didn't feel stuck in that grief. Now, I did have what was called anticipatory grief, and anticipatory grief is when we grieve the loss before the loss actually happens. In the case of my father, he received hospice services, so we were able to spend time with him knowing that the time was near. And so I was grieving while he was still alive. So anticipatory just means that the grief process has started prior to the loss. There is complicated and traumatic grief, and even under complicated, there's many different types of categories, subcategories. But complicated or traumatic means either that the person is kind of stuck in the grief, they haven't been able to kind of work through it. And traumatic is anything that either the attachment figure is gone, or it could be because there's a traumatic event that is attached to it, such as suicide, homicide. And then disenfranchised is another type of grief. This is actually my favorite to work with because I do feel that disenfranchised losses are often misunderstood. So in the book, Disenfranchised Grief, Kenneth Doka writes, a disenfranchised loss is a loss that cannot be openly acknowledged, socially validated, or publicly mourned. And some disenfranchised losses, and this is not a complete list, can include any of these that are on the list. Miscarriage, I've also worked with people who had to deliver their stillborn baby, and the grief that comes with that and the inability to mourn publicly because there's this misunderstanding. Aging, how many of us as we get older miss our youth and really start to grieve our youth? Friendship, sometimes people don't understand that friendship, if there's a loss of a friend, even though that person is still alive, maybe they've ghosted you, maybe they're just no longer speaking to you and you have no idea why, and the friendship is just sort of fizzled. That's a disenfranchised loss because people don't quite understand. Loss of identity happens a lot. Pet loss, you'll see, this is actually the little puppy in this picture is my dog who's still alive, but Layla was my brother's dog, and she died in 2015, I think. So that's why there's a picture of her, because pet loss falls under disenfranchised loss. People who lose a pet sometimes hear, well, you can just get another one. Well, our animals are not to be replaced. They're to be mourned like any other loved one. So we see lots of different types of disenfranchised losses. I would say that most of us right now are probably grieving or have grieved our pre-COVID life. And that might include life events like graduations and birthdays, weddings, just being able to socialize. Those are all disenfranchised losses because people just don't understand like why we feel so hurt or sad or angry about it. So any of these on the list and then some can be disenfranchised losses. The other thing when we're looking at grief and assessing grief is how individualized it is. We want to be able to understand the nature of the relationship to the loss, the nature of the loss. So what were the circumstances of the death or the loss? The griever's personality. So some people might be a little bit more anxious or have more worry. And so maybe their personality might be a little bit more at risk of having a more intense grief experience. What is the person's support system like? We need to make sure that that is assessed, who or what is in their support system, and then make the necessary referrals to whatever support groups or church or whatever they're involved with, family, friends who might be able to offer some support. We want to be able to assess other stressors or life events that are occurring at the same time of grief and how that is impacting the grief experience. Going back to the nature of the relationship to the loss, that includes whatever role that person, if it's a person, played in their life. We find that, especially with widows or widowers, the spouse plays a lot of different roles in the person's life that they're also having to grieve. So we want to be able to assess all of that. Some possible grief symptoms. So there's about 4 categories that grief symptoms fall under: physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. These are just a few that can come up: headaches, stomach aches. The 2 I'm always asking about are change in eating habits and change in sleeping habits. I do make referrals to the doctor in case any of the physical symptoms are really an underlying health issue that have been missed. I want to make sure that that's taken care of. And then if somebody needs a sleep aid, maybe a doctor can prescribe, or if somebody does need an antidepressant to get them through. I'm not a real big believer in medicating grief, but when somebody's grief symptoms are interrupting their life functioning and different parts of their life to the point where maybe medication needs to be looked at, I'm happy to refer back to their doctor to discuss. Some common ones that I see are guilt, regret, and anger. I didn't mention that I actually, besides being an LMFT, I'm actually the client support and wellness professional at the UC Davis Veterinary Medical Teaching Hospital. So I actually have a focus on pet loss. And I find that pet parents often feel much guilt when they have to make a decision around euthanasia, or they feel regret. But it's not uncommon for others to feel that way. Um, Also, if you're in a caregiving role, you might have somebody who's been in a caregiving role, whether it's with their animal or a human loved one. They may feel a sense of relief that they no longer have um, to caregive because it's exhausting. And then they'll feel guilty because, gee, but I love my loved one and I really miss them. How can I feel a sense of relief? So any of these are possible. With children, we'll see maybe some regressive behavior. We might see some uh, types of memory issues or concentration problems that affect grades, maybe some behavioral acting out. So it's not uncommon for children and adults to have some similarity with their grief symptoms, but children, it usually shows up like if there's sleeping problems, they'll want to sleep with their parents or caregivers. They'll feel more clingy. So you'll want to just notice that and again, ask questions around any recent losses. Some at-risk populations. So older men who've lost a spouse, mothers who've lost a child, survivors of traumatic losses, and individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, they're at risk for developing what's called persistent complex bereavement disorder. And so that's when anybody is really sort of stuck. And it is a DSM-5. It's in the DSM-5, I think, as a diagnosis for further study. And so there's criteria that needs to be met, and there's timelines as well. But it basically is categorized by a deep yearning for the person who is now lost. And some risk factors include an insecure attachment style, or again, pre-existing mental health conditions in childhood, the relationship to loss. So again, if you're a mental health professional, you may need to rule out persistent complex bereavement disorder. And again, a simple Google search can get you to that particular assessment. But it's basically really unshakable grief that people are stuck in that. So some interventions that I use, basically I use a lot of psychoeducation like I'm doing now. And the goal of psychoeducation is to normalize and validate people's experiences. So usually I start with just the basics of grief. I'll let them know the terminology that bereavement really means the loss, whatever the loss is, and that grief typically has 2 parts to it, the grief process. One is our internal response to the loss. Those are those symptoms that I was talking about earlier. and the other is mourning. And that's the cultural expression, external expression of loss. We see this with funerals and how people dress in black in some cultures. Maybe some cultures might dress in a different color. Maybe some religions will sit Shiva. But anything that is an expression outwardly of the loss, and that includes storytelling. Sometimes people will come to counseling because their friends and family are tired of listening to the stories. But storytelling is really important because that is the external expression of loss. I do let people know that grief is highly individualized and that the process really has no time limit. The intensity of the grief does kind of relax a little bit, but we don't really get over it. We adjust. We learn to live without our losses, our loved ones. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I educate around primary and secondary losses. Some people might say, gosh, like I'm experiencing this loss, but why does it feel so much heavier? So, besides having to look at the relationship to the loss and whatever the personality of the griever is, I'll let clients know, well, the loss, like with pet loss, the loss is your pet, and that's the primary loss. But the secondary loss or losses could include a change in your routine. Maybe you're not walking with your animal anymore and you're not exercising. You're not being as social, especially with dog owners or horse owners. And of course, with people, if you have somebody who dies, those secondary losses can include the change in relationship, maybe the social elements of it. We see that with divorce, with breakups, who gets which friends, those are secondary losses. It can include identity. Who am I now? When I lost my dog Maslow, I felt a loss of identity. Who am I without my animal, without being a dog mom? The other thing that I let them know, because sometimes people are referred to me a little earlier than they're ready to have these discussions. And I let them know that it's okay if you're not ready. Like we can postpone, we can reschedule. And most people need at least 4 to 6 weeks after a loss to even start sometimes discussing their grief because they're in a state of shock. There's this numbness that happens when people first experience the loss. So I usually just tell people, like, I just want to check in with you. It's okay that you don't have to talk. You don't want to talk. I just want you to know that I'm here if you're ever ready and wanting to talk. There is support. And also, if you're going to be doing this work, know that supporting the bereaved requires a lot of understanding around the grief process and a lot of patience. It can feel like your clients are stuck. And that's where the assessment is really important, an ongoing assessment. And the intensity, you're looking for changes in the intensity of the grief process. And people might be changing some behavior, but it can be very small. So it can feel like, well, gosh, why am I even here? Or, wow, they're telling me the same story over and over. You're going to be looking for those little pieces that are adjusting. That's really kind of what we do in grief counseling, is looking for those small adjustments to encourage them to continue to do that, because sometimes people don't see those shifts. This picture here was done, this is artwork that was done by a friend of mine who died a couple of years ago. And so I thought, again, to bring that in to honor her. And it says, "My story is not over." And that's how I look at the relationships that I have with my losses. They may not be over, but they're different. I've had to adjust a different way of relating to my losses. In the book, and I highly recommend this book on grief and grieving by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, Obviously, I'm sure most of you have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She is the founding mother of death and dying and grief work. And her work was done on the dying. So her 5 stages were really based on people who were dying, not necessarily people who were grieving. But she continued to do work around that and research, and found that the stages do indeed apply. And she did work with David Kessler, and David Kessler is actually a well-known researcher and author of grief books as well, has a website called grief.com. But in the book, I loved this quote: "Healing looks like remembering, recollecting, and reorganizing." Again, we don't get over anything necessarily. It really is about remembering, recollecting, and reorganizing. So you can see how my relationships with my losses are about me remembering and recollecting as I post pictures, and reorganizing my relationships with them as I'm now sharing them with you. So maybe I'm doing a little expression of my own mourning, although my grief is not intensified. This picture here was from a client who did a photo journal in her grief. She told many stories of her memories with her husband, who had died of 20 years. And they used to go to William Land Park. And this is a picture of the duck pond. And so she had many stories around that when she was recollecting and remembering. And the way that she reorganized was to be able to express and share those memories through a photo journal. So Kubler-Ross and Kessler, in the book on grief and grieving, they still review the 5 stages of loss: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But David Kessler adds a 6th stage, and that's finding meaning. And so the book talks about how these feelings, these expressions of grief and loss, are protective factors that allow us to kind of go a little deeper each time. And there's a common misunderstanding that grief is linear because of stage-based or task-based grief models. But the truth is, even in the book, even the authors who've done this research have said, grief is not linear. You can bounce back and forth between all of these feelings. So denial, of course, is that, oh my gosh, I can't believe it happened. I just saw them yesterday, or wow, I was just talking to them. With pet loss, it's, well, I just took my dog on a walk just a couple of hours ago and he was doing fine, and now I'm in the emergency room. It can't be happening. Anger is when we're angry at the person, maybe for not taking care of themselves, angry at the medical professionals, angry at ourselves, angry at God. We might bargain. Bargaining is really when we're maybe saying to God, if somebody is dying, oh, please save my loved one. I promise I will do good. It might be about with ourselves. If we make changes, maybe this person will change. We see that in breakups and divorce. Depression, of course, is this sadness and yearning for our loved ones, for our loss, and feeling just really hopeless and helpless and powerless. And acceptance does not mean that we're okay necessarily with the loss, but we have learned to reintegrate or integrate the loss into our lives and move through it with less intensity. So we're finding meaning in all of these feelings. It's up to us, if we're doing grief counseling, to help clients find meaning in these feelings and in their loss. And so it's really important that we look at how we can best support people through this process and help them find meaning. So that's one model, is the 5 stages of loss. That's a stage-based type of grief model. The next model that I want to talk about is the companioning model. And Alan Wolfelt, I think he's Dr. Alan Wolfelt, he wrote a book, and I think it's called Soul's Companion. It's in my reference slides. But he says, with a companioning model, as counselors, it's our job to bear witness to and to be present with somebody's pain. And the way that we do that is through companioning. And the goal is reconciliation, not resolution. So, how can we help somebody reconcile this loss, not resolve it? I really like this picture that I put in. So, the dog on the left, the more furry one, this was about an hour before her euthanasia appointment. That's my dog, Mia. She died in 2013. The dog on the right is Maslow, and he died a year after she did. Maslow was my soulmate heart dog. So what I noticed is, even in this picture, but the night before, as Mia was getting worse and worse, he stayed near her. He didn't get into her space, but he stayed beside her the night before and then the morning of. I took this picture the morning of, like I said, about an hour before her appointment. And I thought this was a really good representation of companioning. It's where we, as counselors, clinicians, create safety and trust for those we're companioning. And we do that through empathy, and we do that through normalizing, validating, like what you normally would do with your clients or students that you're working with. And you offer empathy and understanding. And you recognize that you cannot disrupt their grief experiences, because grief experiences are transformative, and that you understand that the person who is grieving is forever changed by the loss. And so we're present. We're as present as we possibly can be. Silence is wonderful. Silence allows space for the person to breathe, to think. And just by being present, you're allowing that person to be. I always tell I'm also a clinical supervisor for pre-licensed folks, and I tell them all the time, never underestimate the power of being present. And know that the expert on the person's grief is the person grieving. They are the expert on their grief. And so we want to be present. Again, we want to normalize and validate. We take a supportive, collaborative role. When Maslow died, I had what I called Florence sitters. I asked friends to sit with me. I was pretty shook up. I was in bed for a week when Maslow died. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't eat. And thankfully, being a therapist means you have other therapist friends who totally understand. And so I had friends who took turns every day coming to visit with me. They didn't necessarily have to say anything. They were just companioning with me. And so it was nice to not feel alone. And again, it's not about resolving the feelings of loss. It's about reconciling that this is a new way of having to be in the world without our loved ones, or whatever it is we've lost. It's really important that we help with remembering practices. So when I have somebody come in that I'm working with, I'll ask them, were you able to have a funeral or a celebration of life? With COVID, we have not been able to always have the funerals or the celebration of life events that we really would like to. So then I'll ask, if they haven't had a funeral, how do you want to honor your loved one or your loss? If it's something that they've lost that's in the disenfranchised category, I will still ask them, would you like to hold a service? We can do it together. And how do you want that to look? Do you want to find a poem? Do you want to write a letter? Do you want to say a few words? How do you want to remember? Rituals are so important in the grief process. And so we need to consider also cultural and religious, rituals. So sometimes I'll ask people, in your own culture or religion, How do people say goodbye? Again, whether it's a loss of a person or relationship or an inanimate object, how is it that you want to honor this relationship, this loss? Letter writing or obituaries can be very helpful. I will use letter writing when somebody's really angry, and they could be angry about feeling guilty or stressed. Any feelings that they have, I'll say, you know what, let's write a letter to that feeling, um, and let them know whatever it is that you need to say. Or, okay, you're really angry at the doctor. Let's write a letter to the doctor that we're not going to send. And we can, it just allows for expression to get it out of them. Some people will do artwork. Art therapy and sand tray, by the way, are really wonderful with children. I'm so glad that Dr. Lyles Lurick is doing play therapy next for a presentation, because whatever you learn in there might be helpful if you work with children who are grieving. I'm sure she's going to give you a lot of great things about play therapy in general, but a lot of those things might be able to translate for grieving children. I've had clients put together photo journals, photo albums, do artwork. Some people get pet portraits done. Some people might get portraits done of their loved ones. Tattoos, memorial tattoos are very popular. This is my memorial tattoo. That is a little cow. And at the very bottom, you'll see some dashes and dots. You can't see all of it, but those dashes and dots say dad in Morse code. My father did Morse code in the Army, and also as a kid, he used to milk cows. They had a very small dairy farm. So I have a Holstein cow and dad in Morse code as my memorial tattoo. Music can be very helpful. I had a client going through a divorce where I asked him to put a playlist together. Don't think about it. Just choose music that really sort of speaks to you, moves you. He brought in the playlist. We listened to it together, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize how much the singer is really expressing how I feel about this." So music can be very powerful, even if they're musicians, ask them to write a piece of music. Linking objects are really important. So my brother has my dad's dog tags as well as his dog's tag. He has Layla's dog tag and my dad's dog tags. A lot of pet parents who are grieving will put their dogs or cats or whatever on a keychain, their little tags on a keychain. So you can carry something of somebody's. I actually have a tape measure of my dad's. It's the thing that links me to him. It's kind of weird, I know, but you'll never know. I mean, there's always meaning, right? People can volunteer or donate to a cause. You'll see this with, in lieu of flowers, donate to the American Cancer Society. People can plant a tree or flowers in somebody's name. And then if it is pet loss, paw prints. And in our large animal, we do manes and tails as well for the horse owners. So remembering practices are really important. I think we have a little bit of time left where I can walk you through this exercise. My former students who are probably on this call have seen me do this, because I do this with all of my clients, all of my students. And I was taught when I went to graduate school at Sac State. And I think, Marilee, you're on this call as well. I swear you're the one that taught me this, but I'm not 100% sure. So if you have a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, you can do this exercise with me now. And you can do this with any grieving client, any client at all or student. What you'll do is you'll draw a tree. So if you'll draw a tree right now, that would be great. And it doesn't have to be as nice as this tree that this client did for me. This was my very first internship at an elementary school. And I think this was done by a 12-year-old girl. She must be in her, gosh, probably like late 30s by now. But go ahead and draw a tree. Now, if you're doing this with somebody who's mourning a loss, you would still have them do a tree. And in the roots, you would ask them to write down things that they learned from that, whatever the loss is. For today, I'm going to ask you to write down the lessons that you learned from this presentation. And it only needs to be about 2 or 3 lessons for the sake of time today. When you're working with somebody, you can have, they can have as many lessons as they need to, because there's no rush. You'll want to do this exercise to give plenty of time over a matter of sessions, so that way you can process it with the person. So hopefully you've got 2 or 3 lessons down in your roots. Now, in the trunk of the tree, I want you to write down things that you really appreciated or enjoyed about this presentation. If you're doing this with a client, you would ask them to write down things that they enjoyed or appreciated about their time with their loved one, or whatever the relationship is that they've lost. So for this purpose, for this presentation, only 2 or 3 things that you enjoyed or appreciated about the presentation. And I know Dr. Lyles Lurick does this exercise as well with her young ones, her young clients, because we've talked about that. And then in the leaves of the tree, you'll list your own resources, strengths, support systems that you have. For today's purposes, maybe your resources, strengths. If you want to put down support system from today, that's fine too. But resources, and I do have a slide for resources. So if you need to wait on that, that's okay too. When you're doing this with a client, you'll have them list their resources, strengths, and support system, and you'll want to go over that with them. So that way they know where they can get their supports and have access to resources. So again, the roots in the tree are lessons learned. The trunk of the tree is what they enjoyed or appreciated about their time with their loved one or whatever they've lost. And the leaves are about resources, strengths, and a support system. Like I said, this is a photo of a picture, that one of my own 12-year-old clients did when we worked together. One of my first clients, actually. Some other theoretical approaches for grief and loss. Again, 50 minutes, I'm not able to cover everything. But there are what we call stage-based and task-based models that are out there, including Bowlby's 4 stages of grief. I actually use Bowlby's work at the pet hospital, at the veterinary hospital, because attachment theory is something that I really appreciate. Horowitz, 4 stages of loss, Rando's 6 R's of mourning, Warden's 4 tasks of mourning. My other favorite is Niemeyer's constructivist perspective, where he says we have to find those new storylines. There's a narrative for those narrative therapists in the room. And then I also really appreciate the dual process of grief model. So I just want to mention those for future research, resources. This is much more complex than 50 minutes. This slide I put in not only to kind of just say one of the other jobs that I do is I'm self-employed, where I do trainings and consultations. So there's my contact information if you need it. But I really like this quote: what we have once enjoyed, we can never lose. All that we love deeply becomes a part of us. Maslow, that is my dog, is to the left of, or at least I'm sure you're looking at the screen shows up in the same way. He's the more golden. And the other dog is Kylie. And Kylie was my roommate's dog, and she was my grief therapist when I mourned Maslow. She would come in and jump on the bed with me and sleep with me. I asked my roommate, who's like my sister, and if I could take Kylie for walks. And so I was able to walk with Kylie. So Kylie really helped me. So you never know who's going to be a really great grief counselor. And then grief resources, grief.com, navigatinggrief.com, really great resources. You can find more books if you want to learn about grief and what books might be good for certain types of grief and loss. Grief Share, I used to run a Grief Share group. They're biblically based, Grief Share is. So I used to partner with a church to run Grief Share groups, which is really funny because I'm not a religious person, but hey, I'm always willing to help people. If they're religious, I'm going to use that. I'm going to ask them how that's a strength and a benefit to them, because their faith can be really important in the strengths topic and in the strengths area. But Grief Share, if you go to that website, you can actually type in a zip code, and then a bunch of Grief Share groups will come in that area. Open to Hope, that link has a bunch of different other resources that people can find, whether they're survivors from military loss, if somebody's lost a child, widows, that link is available. I put in our own hospital's pet loss resources and the Lap of Love, which also people can go into to find at-home euthanasia vets and pet loss support groups or therapists. Again, all they have to do is type in a zip code and that area will come up. And then I have a link for children's books through Scholastic that lists like 7 different grief books. So you can also, I don't know if this will be available, but the recording will be available later. So you can always look at the video later, pause on this slide, and visit those links as you need. I have all my references here. So it looks like maybe we have a lot of questions, and we only have 3 minutes left, but I want to ask Drs. Marshall or Dr. Ju, is there a question that keeps coming up that maybe I can answer?
Thank you, Florence, for sharing your expertise. Like, it was great presentation. There was one question, and I know that we have 2 minutes left. So yeah. Are you open to answer the question?
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick because I want to make sure I respect people's time and get them to the next presentation.
Okay, so the question was regarding the grief assessment. Is this applied to a specific age population, or can it be applied to a variety age range?
That's a really good question, and I'm not really sure about that. I would have to look it up and do a little bit more research. I know it is geared towards adults, but I'm not sure about children. And I know that there are some cultural and religious considerations that the clinician just needs to be aware of. So making sure that your assessment includes like the clinical intake, so that way you can have a full picture. So an assessment should never be done by itself anyway. You'll want to do a few assessments to get a good picture, but I'll have to research that, and maybe the folks that have asked it, I can email later.
Thank you. Yeah, I do see a lot of comments in the chat that they really, really appreciate your training today. And I know that we have one more minute left. So I'm going to share the information about CE.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence. Dr. Marshall, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, do you want to talk about the CE? I can put the link in the chat.
That'll be excellent. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Florence, for this wonderful presentation. I know I felt in my heart when you were speaking on some of your loss as well. I connected to that. So thank you for sharing, being so open. And thank you, Hung Young, for volunteering to help inside of this session. If you're looking to get continuing ed units, we have partnered with the European branch of the American Counseling Association. So there's a couple more, I think 3 or 4 more sessions that you might want to attend. Because 2 are simultaneous, you can only get up to 5 credits, but you have until tomorrow, that's March 20th, and that will be 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, to turn in your evaluations. It works a little bit like a conference presentation where you want to go to all your sessions to report all the CEs that you're getting. And then we'll actually give you a certificate to show your CEs through the European branch of the ACA. Let's see, could this count for supervision hours if not CE? It counts for indirect hours, but not supervision.
It can count under the, for those who are licensed or who are pre-licensed and have a supervisor who are willing. Like I know I have a couple of associates. I'm willing to sign off, and it goes under the training column.
Nice. Thank you. Excellent. Great.
So it depends on your supervisor.
It is. It's in the form of a certificate. We'll email the PDF to you and you can put it in your paperwork.
Yeah, so to clarify, if this is the only session that you're going to attend today, you will complete this survey right after this session. If you're planning to attend more session, like you can wait until then and then complete this survey to report and evaluate the sessions and get CE for that. So maybe we can stop recording now, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you for reminding me.